hidden inside your hair, lives a tiny creature that may have preserved one of humanity's oldest secrets. Not inside a cave, not buried beneath ancient ruins, not locked inside a fossil. Inside you. For over 170,000 years, this tiny parasite may have been silently recording the moment humans changed forever. And it all began the day we stopped living completely naked. Imagine waking up in a world where clothing doesn't exist. No fabric, no thread, no stitches, no coats. Only your own skin standing between you and the freezing cold. For hundreds of thousands of years, that was normal. Then something happened. Humans began covering their bodies. That single decision changed how we survived, where we lived, and eventually, how we conquered nearly every environment on Earth. But there's one problem. Ancient clothing almost never survives. Animal hides decay. Plant fibers rot. Time erases nearly every trace. So how can scientists discover when clothing first appeared? If the clothing itself disappeared long ago? The answer wasn't hidden inside a royal tomb. It wasn't discovered beneath an ancient city. It came from one of the last places anyone expected. A tiny parasite that has been living with us for longer than almost any civilization has existed. The story begins in 1913. British archaeologist William Matthew Flinders Petrie was excavating an ancient cemetery at Tarkhan, Egypt. Among hundreds of burials, one modest tomb caught his attention. When it was finally opened, there was almost nothing inside. 5 stone jars, 2 wooden tool handles, a broken pottery lid, and a dusty pile of crumpled linen. So ordinary that it was packed away without another thought. For more than 60 years, nobody looked at it again. Then in 1977, museum conservators reopened that forgotten bundle. Hidden inside was something extraordinary, a nearly complete linen dress. When scientists later dated the fabric, the results stunned everyone. It was nearly 5,500 years old. The Tarkhan dress became the oldest confirmed piece of clothing ever discovered. But the discovery raised an even bigger mystery. The Egyptians almost certainly weren't the first people to wear clothes. Their clothing simply survived when everyone else's had disappeared. Which meant one thing. Somewhere, far deeper in the past, the real beginning of clothing was still waiting to be found. And the next clue wouldn't come from fabric at all. Finding the first clothes ever made isn't as simple as digging deeper. Because clothing has one enormous problem. It wasn't built to last. Whether it's woven from plant fibers or stitched together from animal hides, nature immediately begins destroying it. Bacteria feed on it. Moisture breaks it down. Sunlight weakens it. And year after year, it slowly disappears. Imagine spending weeks making a garment, only for it to vanish without leaving behind a single thread. That's exactly what happened to most of humanity's earliest clothing. For ancient fabric to survive, it needs almost impossible conditions. Bone-dry air, like the inside of an Egyptian tomb. Freezing ice, where decay nearly stops. Or oxygen-free wetlands, where bacteria struggle to survive. Almost everywhere else, clothing simply returns to the earth long before anyone has a chance to discover it. That's why archaeologists rarely find ancient garments. Stone tools can survive for millions of years. Human bones can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. But cloth usually disappears within a tiny fraction of that time. For decades, this missing evidence left one enormous gap in the story of human evolution. If the clothes were gone, how could anyone ever know when humans first started wearing them? Then archaeologists realized something. Maybe they didn't need complete clothing at all. Maybe even the smallest surviving fibers could tell the story. And thousands of miles away, buried beneath an ancient settlement in modern-day Turkey, that's exactly what researchers found. The next breakthrough came from a place no one expected, a prehistoric settlement in modern-day Turkey, known as Catalhoyuk. This remarkable community is nearly 9,000 years old, making it one of the world's earliest farming settlements. While excavating ancient burials, archaeologists uncovered tiny fragments of woven textile. At first, the discovery seemed straightforward. When the fibers were analyzed in 1964, researchers believed they were made from wool. Case closed. Or so it seemed. As technology improved, scientists decided to test the fibers again. The new results told a completely different story. Studies carried out during the 1980s and again in the 2000s suggested the material wasn't wool at all. It came from plants. Then, in 2017, an even more advanced analysis revealed something even more surprising. The fibers had been made from bast, strong plant fibers carefully stripped from tree bark. That single discovery pushed the confirmed history of woven textiles back to around 8,500 years ago, nearly 3,000 years older than the famous Tarkhan dress. It was an extraordinary leap into the past, but it also raised another question. If woven cloth could survive for thousands of years, what about the fibers people worked with before they became fabric? Could those survive too? Most archaeologists thought the answer was no. Then, a cave in the mountains of Georgia proved them wrong. And what researchers found there completely transformed the timeline of human clothing. The story didn't end with woven fabric. In fact, it was only getting started. Deep inside Zudzwana Cave in the country of Georgia, archaeologists uncovered something almost impossible to believe. Not clothing, not woven cloth, but hundreds of tiny plant fibers, left behind by people who lived there 30,000 years ago. Many of the fibers had been carefully twisted into thread. Some were tied into small knots. Simple details, but powerful evidence that human hands had deliberately worked these fibers long before recorded history. Then came an even bigger surprise. Several of the fibers still carried traces of color: black, gray, turquoise, even a faint hint of pink. These weren't random stains left by nature. Researchers believe the fibers had been intentionally dyed, suggesting that people weren't making textiles just for survival. They were also making them with skill, care, and perhaps even beauty in mind. It painted a remarkable picture. Thousands of years before the pyramids, long before writing, people were already collecting fibers, preparing thread, and experimenting with color. Suddenly, the history of clothing stretched back far beyond anything archaeologists had imagined. But even these extraordinary fibers couldn't answer the biggest question. Finding thread isn't the same as finding clothing. To travel even deeper into the past, scientists had to stop searching for fabric altogether. Instead, they began looking for the tools that could have made it. And deep inside a South African cave, they found one of the oldest clues ever discovered. Homo sapiens weren't the only humans forced to survive brutal winters. Across Ice Age Europe, the Neanderthals faced freezing temperatures that could turn deadly in a matter of hours. Without protection, survival would have been almost impossible. For years, some scientists even suggested that Neanderthals disappeared because they never developed clothing as effectively as modern humans. But the evidence tells a far more complicated story. At several Neanderthal sites, archaeologists uncovered large stone scrapers. These weren't ordinary cutting tools. Their worn edges suggest they were repeatedly used to scrape flesh and fat from animal hides, an essential step before hides can be turned into usable clothing. Then researchers examined the animal bones found at those same sites. Again and again, they discovered wolves, foxes, hares, animals prized not only for their meat, but for their thick insulating fur. The same species also appear at early Homo sapiens camps. But there's one important difference. At Homo sapiens sites, these fur-bearing animals appear far more frequently. That doesn't necessarily mean Neanderthals lacked clothing. It suggests something more subtle. Both species may have worn animal hides, but modern humans seem to have produced and used clothing more consistently, possibly creating layered garments that offered better protection against extreme cold. That small advantage may have helped our ancestors expand into environments where survival became increasingly difficult. Still, stone scrapers and animal hides only tell part of the story. They suggest clothing. They don't prove exactly when humans first began wearing it. To move further back in time, scientists needed evidence from the act of making clothing itself. And hidden inside a South African cave, they discovered a tiny tool that may have stitched together one of humanity's oldest inventions. Clothing doesn't begin with fabric. It begins with a tool. Something sharp enough to pierce hide, precise enough to stitch it together. and strong enough to survive repeated use. That's exactly what archaeologists found inside Sabutu Cave, South Africa. Among hundreds of ancient bone tools, one tiny fragment stood out. It was long, thin, and carefully shaped to a remarkably fine point. Its tip was so delicate that researchers believe it wasn't designed for hunting, but for piercing animal hide with incredible precision. In other words, it may have been used to help make clothing. The needle dates to approximately 61,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest known pieces of indirect evidence for clothing ever discovered. Of course, the needle doesn't prove someone was wearing a finished garment, but it proves something just as important. Someone had already developed the technology needed to create one. By now, the evidence formed an incredible timeline. A 5,500-year-old dress, 8,500-year-old woven textiles, 30,000-year-old dyed fibers, a 61,000-year-old bone needle. Each discovery pushed the story further into the past, but none of them answered the biggest question. When did humans actually begin wearing clothes? To solve that mystery, scientists had to stop looking at artifacts altogether. Instead, they turned to something that had been living alongside humans for hundreds of thousands of years. A tiny parasite that had unknowingly preserved one of the oldest clues in human history. And that clue was hiding inside human lice. Here's something most people never think about. The moment humans began wearing clothing, they accidentally created an entirely new habitat. Warm, dark, protected. The perfect home for a tiny parasite. Human lice exist in two distinct subspecies. The head louse spends its entire life on the scalp, feeding among the hair. The body louse is completely different. It doesn't live on human skin. It lives inside clothing, leaving only briefly to feed before returning to the fabric. That tiny difference changes everything. A body louse could never exist until humans were wearing clothing often enough to create a permanent home for it. So scientists asked a remarkable question. When did head lice and body lice become different species? To find out, researchers compared their DNA. By measuring the genetic differences between them, they estimated when the two lineages split apart. The results were astonishing. The split most likely occurred sometime between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That means humans were probably wearing some form of clothing long before the oldest surviving dress, long before woven textiles, and even before the oldest bone needle ever discovered. A parasite no bigger than a grain of rice had preserved one of the oldest clues in human history. Not inside a fossil, not inside a cave, but inside its own DNA. And after following every clue, we're left with one final question. What does all of this really tell us about the moment humans stopped living naked? So when did humans stop living naked? The honest answer is we still don't know. Not exactly. Instead of one final discovery, we have a trail of clues. Each one pushes the story a little further into the past. A forgotten linen dress hidden inside a museum collection for more than 60 years. Tiny woven fibers, recovered from one of the world's earliest farming communities. 30,000-year-old threads carefully spun, tied, and even dyed by human hands. A finely crafted bone needle. Evidence that someone possessed the skill to stitch animal hides together. And finally, a tiny parasite, whose own DNA preserved a clue stretching back as far as 170,000 years. On their own, none of these discoveries tells the complete story. Together, they reveal something remarkable. The history of clothing wasn't preserved by fabric alone. It survived through tools, ancient fibers, animal remains, and even the evolution of a creature most people spend their lives trying to avoid. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson archaeology can teach us. History isn't always hidden inside golden treasures, or buried beneath magnificent monuments. Sometimes, the biggest discoveries begin with the smallest details. A forgotten bundle of dirty laundry, a few colored threads scattered across a cave floor, a carefully carved bone needle, or a parasite no one expected to matter. Somewhere, the final piece of this mystery may still be waiting, inside a museum drawer that has never been reopened, beneath the soil of an unexplored cave, or hidden within evidence we haven't yet learned how to recognize. Until then, the oldest story ever worn by humanity remains unfinished, waiting for the next discovery to finally reveal when humans first got dressed.